Let's break it down. We already knew that the US boat strike in the Caribbean raised serious legal and moral questions. Now, there is a new detail that changes the story again. According to a briefing described to CNN and other outlets, the Navy admiral who ran the operation, Frank Bradley, has told lawmakers that the small boat was not heading for the United States. Instead, he says it was moving to meet a larger vessel bound for Suriname, on the northeast coast of South America. I'm Imran, a Middle East-based analyst who follows US politics and global affairs. Let's look at what that actually means. First, let's remember what the public was told at the start. Back in September, after the strike, Trump and his team described this as a tough but necessary operation to stop a drug boat heading to the United States with illegal narcotics. The message was very clear. This was about protecting Americans directly from a threat that was on its way to US shores. Now, that version is being challenged by the Admiral's own private briefing to Congress. Bradley reportedly told lawmakers that the small boat was on its way to transfer its cargo to a larger ship that was going to Suriname, not to the United States. Yes, he still argued that the drugs might eventually find their way toward the US from Suriname, but US drug officials point out that routes through Suriname are mainly used to move cocaine to Europe, not to North America. So the picture changes from boat full of drugs directly heading to the US to something closer to boat carrying drugs in the Caribbean that could one day possibly connect into global routes that may include the US. That may sound like a small technical difference, but for legal and political arguments, it is a big one. Second, think about what this does to the idea of self-defense. The Trump administration has tried to frame these operations as part of a wider campaign to keep dangerous narcotics out of the United States. Under that logic, suspected traffickers at sea can be treated almost like fighters in a conflict, and military force becomes acceptable instead of normal law enforcement tools. But if the drugs on this specific boat were moving along a route mainly used for Europe and not directly toward the US, then the imminent threat to Americans looks much weaker. At that point, the question becomes, is this really self-defense? Or is it about showing how far the US is willing to go in its anti-drug campaign, even when the immediate risk to the homeland is not clear? Third, this new detail lands on top of what we already knew about the way the strike unfolded. Lawmakers who saw the video say the attack happened in two stages: an initial strike that tore the small boat apart, and a later strike on the wreckage after two people had survived and were seen clinging to what was left of the vessel. Those survivors appeared to be drifting and at one point waving before a second round of missiles hit and there were no survivors left. That sequence has already led some legal experts and members of Congress to say this may go against the normal rules for the use of force, which require extra care when people are clearly out of the fight. Now add the Suriname detail on top of that. It is no longer just a debate about how the strike was carried out. It is also a question about why this specific boat was treated as such an urgent target in the first place, if it was not sailing toward US territory. From outside the US, that raises a wider concern. If a powerful country can justify lethal action by saying, well, the drugs could eventually end up in our country one day, then where does that logic stop? Almost any shipment anywhere in the world could be connected to some possible future harm through a chain of maybes. Fourth, what does this mean for trust? Governments always want the public to accept their explanations when they use force, but trust depends on those explanations staying consistent. Here, the story has shifted. First, a boat heading to the United States. Now, a boat connected to a route toward Suriname, with a possibility that the drugs might later reach the US. When details like that change after the fact, it makes people wonder what else might be shifting behind closed doors: the legal opinions, the intelligence assessments, the rules of engagement. So, let's break it down one last time. This new report says the boat destroyed in that controversial strike was not actually on a direct path to the United States. It was reportedly part of a route toward Suriname, which experts say usually feeds the European market, yet the strike is still being defended as an act of protecting Americans. For many observers, that gap between the original story and the new details is exactly why this case has become a test of how far the US can stretch words like defense and threat when it uses military power far from home. If you're in the US or you live in Latin America or the Caribbean, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Does this look like a necessary tactic in the fight against drugs, or like an overreach that could damage America's credibility? This is Imran Breaks It Down, and we'll keep breaking it down together.